Senator Claire McCaskill has just released a report indicating that World War II veterans that were subject to mustard gas testing, they were essentially used as human guinea pigs, being exposed to mustard gas, were denied benefits that would have helped treat some of the ailments that they developed as a result of this type of testing. Now, this is a quick look into some of the issues of the VA and some of the issues within the military when it comes to non-disclosures and not being able to speak to doctors about what they have gone through some testing like this, and the ramifications of not getting the care that they need as a result of that. So let's get to that right now. About 60,000 military service members were used as human guinea pigs in a military research program to test protective equipment. Roughly 40,000 of them received high levels of full body exposure to mustard gas or lewisite, another toxic agent. The VA has rejected the claims of 85% of the veterans who applied for benefits related to the secret testing. In fact, from 2005 to 2015, the VA identified 1,213 disability claims related to mustard agent exposure from 792 World War II veterans. Of those claims, 1,028 were denied. Only 40 veterans nationwide are now receiving benefits, or the benefits. So think about this. These troops, these members of the military, were part of a secret testing program, and I say secret because they didn't even know it was happening to them. They were having some sort of substance rubbed onto their skin. They were forced to breathe in some sort of mysterious gas, and then later on, many of them did develop some serious health issues, including skin cancer, lung problems, breathing problems, and also, in some cases, strokes. And so they applied to get health benefits so they can treat these issues. But what a lot of people don't know is they had to sign basically non-disclosure contracts that would ensure that they could not share or talk about the testing that they underwent. And so when they went to go see a doctor, they couldn't tell the doctor what they had gone through. When they went to the VA, they couldn't even talk to the VA about what they had gone through. And so as a result, that burden of proof in order to get the benefits was ridiculous, and they were denied those benefits.
And it wasn't even declassified until 1975, and up until 1991, even after it was declassified and people knew that this was happening, they were threatened that they'd be court-martialed or get dishonorably discharged from the military if they were still, or basically their reputations would be tarnished. And what makes me think about when I hear stories like this, and this is very common, especially in the American military, you know, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, you hear about the American military testing out things on soldiers, testing out things on people that they deem to be enemies of the state as well. What makes me think is, how can someone be a part of an organization that that consistently engages in these inhumane practices and not speak up about it? And I know the reason, obviously, we fucking ruin whistleblowers' lives in America. You see Chelsea Manning. Yeah. You see what is happening to Julian Assange. You see what's happening to Edward Snowden. But the thing is, still, how is there not more of a backlash? How are people not freaking out and allowing this to continue?
Yeah, oftentimes when we talk about the VA, and this is a real issue, so I don't begrudge anyone who does mention this, we talk about how severely underfunded it is, we talk about the inefficiencies within the VA, but we don't talk about the certain agreements that these soldiers are forced to sign even when they have unwittingly underwent this type of testing that has severe health ramifications. Yeah. And so I think that the conversation should shift to that issue, and I definitely commend Senator Claire McCaskill for talking about this and addressing it. In fact, there has been legislation proposed known as the Arla-Harrell Act, and essentially what that would do is ensure that it would, again, lessen the burden of proof that these soldiers or veterans have to give the VA in order to get the benefits that they need. And by the way, the hypocrisy of our politicians is what drives me crazy, because Anytime they want to garner support for a war, whether it's a preemptive war or for our perpetual war in the Middle East, they will immediately go to the troops and say, oh, you got to support the troops, the troops, the troops, the troops. When you have politicians running for office, they will bring up the VA issue for political gain, for political exploitation, if you ask me. But when it comes to the real issues at hand and real solutions that they can, or real solutions that they can take, they just don't do it. They don't do it. It's more for political gain than anything else. Anytime you hear about them saying support the troops, it's because they want to convince you as American people to go to war. They don't actually care about the troops. They don't actually care about the veterans. When you look at the vast amounts of the veterans that are currently homeless, much less those that don't have health benefits, you'll understand just how much of a hypocrisy it is when they say support the troops, but then refuse to do anything to actually support them.
But do you think those people are inherently evil? So this is what I'm asking, because this is what I don't understand. I like, when you're a politician and you're constantly suppressing bills like this one, or bills that will help veterans, for example, like the one that was the bipartisan one that Bernie Sanders and John McCain passed together. When you're trying to suppress, when you're opposing bills like that, what is going on in your head? Do you not realize that these are real humans and there are real consequences to the actions that you've previously taken? You might not know them, but they're real humans and they're suffering. And like, how can a human sit there and be like, well, look, I'm going to be pragmatic about this, and I'm being whipped into making sure that I vote against this bill that will help possibly millions of Americans?
I think that government corruption does a lot of terrible things to people who might have gotten involved in politics with good intentions in the first place. I've seen it happen with President Obama. I've seen it happen with so many politicians that showed a great deal of promise, and then as soon as there was a profit motive, as soon as they had to worry about getting reelected, as soon as they realized, hey, I need to play ball with this corrupt political system in order to have a career, then yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people who are not principled will completely disregard human life and do what benefits them. And that's that's the most depressing part about all of this, because these are people who did decide to put their lives on the line to protect this country. And whenever you hear politicians talk about it, again, it's just for political gain. They don't take real actions to help protect these individuals or take care of them when they finally come back.